Hey everybody, it's me, Angela Walters. Welcome to this week's live chat. I'm super excited to talk about quilting and answer your questions live. So if you're watching me live right now, as always, I have Jessica behind the computer. She is monitoring the chat. She'll write those down and give those to me at the end. She'll kick out the bad bots and we'll have a great old time. So I wasn't here last week. I had a little girls sew trip. It was a lot of fun, but I'm glad to be back with this week's live chat. And I have got some exciting news. I actually finished a project. So this cute little EPP block is not huge, but it's stunning. And it only took me like a year and a half. You know, the thing about projects is, sometimes they take a little bit longer than you think, but I don't let my projects make me feel guilty. I just get to them when I can. But I thought it'd be fun to use this unquilted little top as kind of an example of how I pick designs for a quilt, or the things I consider when I'm trying to decide how to quilt. Normally, when I do a live chat or a presentation on that, I'm showing quilts that are already finished. And it's super difficult to imagine a quilt quilted any other way, or even to imagine it unquilted. So this is gonna be actually a two-part video series. This part, I'm gonna kind of share the things I consider when picking out designs, a little bit of my process, if you will. And then in the next live chat, I'll hopefully have it quilted and finished, and we'll see how much it matches up with the plan. Now, I will tell you that the question I'm probably asked the most is, how do I pick designs for a quilt? How much planning do I do? Stuff along that lines. And really, the sad news is that no matter how experienced you get at machine quilting, sometimes it can be difficult to pick out those designs. But as I sat down and kind of thought, okay, it's not like I sit down and run through like a checklist on the quilt, or it's not like I have like this set process, but these are the things I think about when I'm picking the designs. And these things aren't anything that you have to think through, but it might help, I don't know, give you a guideline or give you a direction to work in, or at the very least, let you see how crazy I overthink things. So using some other examples of other quilts, I'll kind of show you what I think through, and then we'll like I said, see the new result of it in the next live chat. Now, I am gonna pause and say that we're not gonna have another live chat next week. So next week I'm gonna have to skip because it is spring break. We're gonna go visit my daughter in college. So the next live chat will be in 2 weeks. So I'm giving myself a 2-week deadline to get this quilted. Thankfully, it's pretty small, so it shouldn't be too difficult. So again, if you're watching, you can type your questions in, and hopefully this will help kind of, I don't know, give you an example. So here's the quilt in its flat glory. Of course, we know it's not super huge, and but the process that I go through, or the things I think about, are the same whether it's a little quilt or a big quilt. Truthfully, when I'm working on quilts, or especially when I quilted for customers and was quilting a little bit more, I would usually get the next quilt out in line before it was time to quilt it. So I'm already kind of thinking through these things before the quilt ever comes to my frame. The reason I like to say that is if you're working on a quilt top for yourself, it's okay to go ahead and kind of start brainstorming or daydreaming about how you might quilt it once it's finished. It just kind of, I don't know, I kind of think if it gets in the back of my mind, maybe my mind kind of works on it even if I'm not consciously thinking about it. I don't know if that's true or not, but I think it sounds good and we'll just go with that. So things I'm thinking about the quilt. First of all, what's my favorite thing about the quilt? This is important because I want to use the quilting to highlight that aspect. So I know I've talked about this before in any Help How Do I Quilt It lectures, but for instance, if the favorite thing about the quilt is the fabric, I'm going to use the quilting designs to highlight that. If it's the pattern, I'm going to do that. It could be just the fact I want to quilt something really cool on it. The quilting might be the most important thing. Now, in this particular example, the most important thing is the piecing, right? The English paper pieced aspect of it. I love the fabric. It's from my fabric collection, but man, it took forever, and I don't want to do anything that takes away from that English paper piecing. The second thing, and probably just as important, is the block size. Picking designs for your quilt is dependent on the area you have to fill them in. I mean, that's just the truth of the matter. If I have a little block, obviously I can only fit so much stuff in there, or if I have a bigger block, I can do more. And so in my mind, I kind of have a rough idea, this design is good for big blocks, or this design is good for little blocks. And so really the block size is gonna play a big role in that. So for instance, in this particular block, it was the center of a quilt. It's a big circle block for Tula. I have plenty of room. In fact, so much room I could play around with different fillers and different designs. That's obviously not a design idea that's going to work in a smaller block. In this particular example, I have a lot of that background space, even though it's technically inside the block, that's what we'll call it. But for those larger blocks, I can kind of dream bigger, come up with some more ornate designs, use different fillers and textures. And so that's always a great option. But of course, for this quilt, those blocks are not very large. And then even within the same quilt, so this is a quilt by Tula. If I have room for some lines, but maybe not others. So really just kind of knowing dot to dot, great for smaller blocks, big motifs with feathers, better for bigger blocks, that kind of thing. And again, it's not that I have a set chart or the designs all written down, but it does help me kind of push in direction. Now this example, those blocks, I know it's hard to get an idea of scale on here, but they're only about 2 inches big. And so in those littler blocks, maybe it's just going to be continuous curve. And continuous curve is that design that goes from one corner to the next, just a nice curved line. I love continuous curve. It's one that I use in a lot of different ways, but it definitely works better in smaller blocks. So in this particular example, I have a very good idea that I'll be using some of that in that quilt. So if we're looking at this particular quilt block, the blocks are smaller and there's not enough room to do a big or ornate motif. And I actually don't want to do that because I don't want to take away from the piecing. So I'm going to opt for some continuous curve just to kind of fill in those blocks. But there are other things to consider too when we're looking at the background of the quilt, right? What kind of designs do I need? Block design, background design, sashing design. If I'm looking at the background, the amount and the shape of that matters. For instance, if the background is around the block, or maybe it's a different part, but that's really going to play a role in the designs I pick. So we've seen this during the live chat before. This is the famous Tula butterfly quilt, which I've quilted 3 of them. That background space, that cream fabric, it's big. There's plenty of room. It's irregularly shaped around the edges, but I have plenty of room to add super ornate details. Whereas this particular quilt, also by Tula, has smaller background area, that same cream fabric. It's irregularly shaped. I know that a feather is not going to fit really good in that space because of the way it looks. So that's really going to inform how I quilt the designs. So if we look here, we can see the feather, or I have a better picture from another butterfly quilt. That's something I can do in a bigger background area. Definitely not something I'm going to try to squeeze in between the blocks of that Peaks and Valleys quilt. So looking at the jagged edges there, I know that it can't be something that's going to really extend all the way, so dot to dot it is what I end up doing there. So again, not only the size of it, but the shape of it, if that makes sense. If it's very jagged around the edges, it's going to be hard to fit in like a feather or something like that. I guess if you were to take my whole presentation and distill it down to one point, will it fit a feather or not? That's kind of usually my litmus test for that. This particular quilt was by Allison Glass, and we can see that background area. They're smaller sections. They're kind of irregular. They're not your normal squares. And so in that example, I had to kind of get creative and think a little bit outside the block and kind of create those secondary designs. Again, big, bold feathers, not going to work in that area. And I guess it could work, and if that's what I wanted to quilt, it'd be totally fine, but I knew it would take away from those beautiful blocks, and that was the most important thing about that quilt. All right, another thing we have to think about is the fabric choices. Not just print or solid, but fabric colors as well. Am I going to have a stark difference between the two colors? Busier fabrics versus solid fabrics really does play a role into that. So let's look at some examples. Let's go back to that black and white circle that we saw earlier. If I'm dealing with this particular area, those are very contrasting colors. And I like to use thread colors that blend into the quilt top. That's just my preference. So if I'm quilting something in this area, knowing that I'm going to switch between thread colors, that means some designs will not work. I'm not going to be able to quilt a big feather that kind of goes right over the two of those because I'd have to switch colors within the feather. And while it could be possible, it's not going to be ideal. So looking at that bigger feather, that's probably not what I'm going to put in that area. I would have to either put one on each side or go with what I ended up doing in that block, and I'll go back so you can see it, creating a different motif altogether. Now, if those two fabrics were similar in color, if they were like, let's say, grays, I might go ahead and then quilt that feather in that whole area and treat it as one piece. I will say the more you work with designs, the easier it gets to kind of imagine what it'll do, and you also learn what you do and don't like. Usually when I quilt a quilt, I'm like, okay, I've learned something new, either what not to do next time or what to do next time. Now, solid fabrics, of course, great because you can see the quilting. And so if I'm working on a quilt with solid fabrics, I might use designs that take a little bit more time to put together since you can actually see what's going on there. On the flip side, if I'm working on a quilt with busy fabrics, bright colors, something you can't really see the quilting anyway, I'm probably not going to take all the time and effort to put something ornate and complex in that area. I kind of like to think of it as my return on my quilting time investment. Now, I don't know if that makes me lazy or efficient, but we'll go with efficient. The idea being, if you're not going to be able to see it anyway, I'm going to save that effort and that practice or that design for an area that you can kind of see it. Now, there is a caveat to that. If I'm quilting a quilt, let's say it's for myself, and it does have bold, busy fabrics, and I want to see the quilting, I can actually put a solid fabric on the backing so I could eventually switch it over and see it, flip it over and see it on the back. So there are times, but if you've ever quilted busy fabrics, you know it's hard to see where you're going. It's hard to see the design once you're done. But that's also a great spot to practice your quilting designs. So if you're working on a quilt with busy fabrics and you've just been wanting to practice that feather, that's the place to do it. Because when you're done, you're not going to really see it anyway. So if I have a quilt with a lot of solid fabrics or solid areas, that's where I'm going to put the more intense quilting. And so this example is the Pathfinder quilt. I loved the different colors it was pieced with, and so I had fun quilting different textures in the backgrounds. Now, if this had been maybe a bunch of busier fabrics, I would have picked one design for all the backgrounds and a different design for the other blocks. So here's an example of some busier fabrics that I quilted from our Build-A-Quilt. Looking at this block, you can kind of see the quilting a little bit in the background, but in a lot of those pinks and grays, you really can't see the quilting. So within that area, I kept it easy with wishbones and some echo lines. And I know you can't see the quilting anyway, but I guess that's kind of the point, right? So, you know, when we're looking at those busy fabrics, sometimes I kind of think of that as a place to just relax and have fun with it, or not to overthink it. And then in this example, I saved my more dense quilting, the combining of designs, the different textures for the background where you could kind of see the quilting there. So the fabric really does play a role. So looking at this, the fabrics were for my Crystals fabric collection. They're pretty bright and bold, and the quilting is not going to show up a whole lot anyway. So another reason to kind of go with that continuous curve design. It's going to give it a nice texture without, spending a lot of time in an area you can't really see it. Now that aside, I do like the light gray pieces in the block. And so maybe in those areas, or they're more white, they're technically light gray, but they look white on the screen. In those white blocks, I might do something a little bit more ornate. Maybe put some pebbles in there or just a different texture just to show it off. But nothing too crazy again, because those are little bitty pieces. All right, another thing I think about, and when I was typing this all out, I was like, man, I really overthink things. Not anything else in life, just my quilting designs, but the block layout. Kind of like, how am I going to approach this quilt, right? Am I going to go from block, sashing block? Am I going to, how am I going to break this into chunks so I can quilt it? Because the designs I'm going to pick are dependent on that. So when I'm looking at the block layout, it could be something like, again, this Allison Glass quilt, your standard block, block, block layout. Great, I need a design that's going to fill that block and take me right into the next one. And so that I can move on and go from block to block. I like to be efficient with my quilting, and so I'm always kind of thinking, where am I starting and where do I need to end up? And I pick designs that will help me do that. An example would be like if I have a square and I need to come back to the starting point, I'm going to do something like continuous curve that I know will bring me back to my starting point. I like to call that a boomerang design. But if I want to end up on the opposite side, for example, like here, because I'm going to quilt those several blocks, then I need a design that moves on. So again, just how am I going to actually work through it? And that really helps me pick those designs. Sometimes it's not quite as obvious. It might be something like this quilt that's almost kind of like a medallion. Now, even though the designs kind of go out like that, they're just block based. And so I'm going to be looking at the blocks as I'm quilting on it. Now, I should pause and say the way you approach your quilt is dependent on a lot of things. Your preferences, how you like to go about it, and then also the machine that you're using. So if I'm quilting on my sewing machine, I can pick and choose where I want to start, and that gives me a little bit more freedom of how I'm going to approach the quilt. But on a long arm, I'm working in straight lines, kind of in sections like this. So that's going to determine how I'm going to work my way down the quilt. That means I'm probably not going to pick long diagonal lines because that's not super easy to do on a long arm. And just because it's not easy to do is a good reason to avoid it. So again, looking at the layout. And every quilt's a little bit different. I love the unique layouts of some quilts, but sometimes it makes it tricky, right? Looking at this particular quilt, this is from the Midnight Quilter. It's the Midnight Stars quilt. You know, how am I going to break that up? Those littler blocks are going to fit within my sewing machine space, but that bigger block isn't. That's a big star block right there, so I'm not going to pick something like a feather wreath that needs to fill that whole thing. I'm going to look at the individual pieces. So maybe I might need designs that can be broken up into sections, like dot to dot or smaller type feathers. Or it could be something like this. This is the Impracticality quilt. This has no normal layout. It was pieced from the center, working its way out. So when I'm looking at that, it's not like I'm going from block to block. Instead, I'm going from, section to section within that bigger piece. And working on this on a long arm means I have to kind of break that up into chunks as I go down. So again, just looking at the design and picking them out. And here you can kind of see a more up-close picture of some of that detail. Even though this quilt doesn't look anything like my English paper pieced quilt, the way it went together is pretty similar, and that goes in circles. So I'm going to use a lot of this kind of idea to fill in the blocks. So smaller dot to dot designs, and then maybe a couple of pebbles in just to add a pop of texture. As you're quilting through your quilts or looking at stuff on Pinterest, falling down that Pinterest rabbit hole like we all do, think how can you apply this to quilt tops you have, right? There's not a whole lot similar here, but the layout is similar, and that kind of gives me some design inspiration. And this is just one more example of the layout. How am I going to progress from block to block? How am I going to work through that? Because my goal, doesn't always happen, but my goal is to quilt the whole block without having to break thread. We know I'm kind of adverse to that. I like to use traveling to move around. So, how am I going to move through that block? And that will help me pick out designs. Now, the one thing that you don't always hear people talk about is the time constraints. Let's be honest. Sometimes we make a quilt top and we need to get that thing finished tomorrow because the baby shower's tomorrow and we thought it would be a great idea to make a baby quilt the night before. I cannot do trapunto in one day, or I can't do those ornate designs. So keeping that in mind really helps me know, okay, how much time do I have to spend on this? And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think, doing whatever you want on a quilt is important, and if I do it quickly, that's fine. It's gonna still be a quilt. That's a great thing about the machine quilting. It adds a layer of art to your quilt, but it's also functional. And as long as it's performing its function of holding those layers together, it's fine. So this particular quilt, I'm giving myself about 2 weeks. So I have a little bit of time to play with that. I'll be out of town. If you know me, I'll probably be leaving that till the last minute. I'll be doing it the night before the live chat, but I'll get it done. But I probably won't do, super trapunto-y custom crosshatch on it just because I don't have unlimited time. So that means, for instance, that really means just knowing how long it takes you to do the designs. This is all relative, right? What is quick for you? What is not quick for you might be different for somebody else. So looking at this example, I'm not going to do crosshatch if I have a limited time. I'm not going to do things with a lot of echo or a lot of traveling or a lot of dense details. Now, that doesn't mean I can't do it. I could just spread it out, make it less dense. Or I can pick something like the wood grain that still gives it a nice texture, but I know that it's easier and quicker for me to quilt, right? So kind of as you're quilting, being honest with yourself about how it's going, like this is taking forever. This is probably design I'm not going to do if I'm on a time crunch. So there's nothing wrong with having that kind of play into your design choice. And then lastly, what do you want to quilt? There are times where I'm like, you know what? I just want to quilt a swirl. I'm feeling fluid. I'm feeling flow. I want to do that. Other times I might want to use my ruler, and that's okay. Don't fight it. There's no one way you have to quilt your quilt. So whatever you're kind of in the mood for or whatever inspiration strikes, go ahead and lean into that. And that's going to kind of help keep you excited about the project and help you have fun with it. So knowing all those things, now let's look back at here and let's see kind of how we're going to how I'm going to tackle this. So we've already talked about the size of the block is small. The fabric is pretty busy. They're not going to see the quilting a whole lot. I might use some textures in that area. Ooh, my computer froze up. There we can see the prints that are in some of the prints. They're not all in that block, but you can tell that it's pretty bold. So probably in those darker colors, I'll do a simpler version of continuous curve, and maybe in the lighter blues and in the whites, something a little bit more, just a little bit more intricate. Nothing crazy, but just a little more intricate. Something like this. So this is that continuous curve example. Since this block, or I'm kind of tackling it like a quilt, but it's a block, that block goes in the round, I need to be able to move from one point to the next. And so picking a continuous curve design like this lets me start at one corner and end at the opposite. So that's probably the design I'll use in most of those blocks, maybe slightly different variations of it. I might do some geometric dot to dot just for fun, but it's going to help me move my way around that block. And then maybe for fun, I might throw in some little pebbles or a little bit of detail. Now, I should have said this at the beginning. When I'm thinking through how I'm going to quilt my quilt, I don't plan the whole thing out. I just need to know somewhere to get started. And then once I get started, the designs also come. There's nothing wrong with planning it all out, with having your game plan, but don't be afraid to change it because it might not work once you get to quilting. And so even though I'm sitting here saying, oh, this is how I'm going to do it, we might see a totally different result when we see the finished quilt. So this is just kind of getting me a game plan so I can get started, and then we'll see what happens with it. It's always kind of fun to see how it ends up. And then there we can see some of that in practicality quilting, some of that geometric shape. So when I'm working my way through those kind of layers, I might alternate. That's kind of a little rule I give myself. If I do something geometric in one, I'll do something curvy in the next. But we'll see. We'll see. Who knows? Inspiration might strike. But what about the background? Now, this is not a large quilt, and the background isn't square. It doesn't have a bunch of area. I have more area at the top and bottom than the sides. The reason I made it nice and long and skinny is I'm going to probably hang it up somewhere at the building, and that gives me a little bit more of length to it. So I could do a big feather in the background. That's always a go-to, kind of like that idea. It won't be able to wrap all the way around because I don't have enough space on two of the sides. So I'm kind of like, I might not do that. Not that I don't love feathers, but I'm kind of intrigued by an earlier English paper piecing quilt that I've done. So this is about the same size as that block. And I did this for the Midnight Quilter, and I started kind of pulling out the points and kind of building off of that initial shape with those points into the negative space. But then I changed it up and I did some swirls, which is fine. I think I'm going to, though, go back and kind of visit that idea of building out that medallion look, but keep going with it. When I'm looking at a quilt that I'm going to do, I don't want to quilt the same way. I like to switch it up. So using this exact idea, I probably wouldn't do, but I can definitely look at earlier quilts I've done and pull out those pieces that I like. So kind of continuing that block structure into the background, I think would be a lot of fun. And here's a closer view of that. So you can kind of see those geometric points, but instead of going to a filler, I'm going to keep kind of building it out. This will work, I think, because the narrower sides, it'll just run off the edge and I don't have to worry about trying to connect it all the way around. And then, as I was kind of thinking about that, I was up late one night, not able to sleep, so I was kind of brainstorming what I was going to do. I remembered the mandala quilt that we did in an earlier free motion challenge. And the mandala, we kind of did some echoing, we did some fun stuff in that video series, and you could check it out if you want. But in the background, I did some kind of arcs that kind of radiated out, kind of like that same idea that I'm thinking about doing for this one. Now, what I loved about that is all the arcs don't actually meet up with each other. This is awesome because it doesn't have to be perfect. I can just quilt those spaces and fill it in. And so I was kind of thinking it would be fun to do that on this quilt. So creating those shapes, but not making them touch, just kind of spacing them out and then using echoing to fill them in. So that, and I also kind of liked this shape, that kind of pointy shape. So that's kind of my inspiration. Now, I sat down at my computer real quick right before I went live and I mocked this up. It's not pretty in any way, shape, or form, but it'll give you an idea of what I'm thinking of. So knowing that you can actually see the quilting in the background, and I want to do a little bit more intricate look there, I'm going to build off of the piecing and create that shape using the points of the block as a guide. I love marking out reference lines, but anytime I can use the piecing as a guide, I'm there. So looking at those blue points, I can kind of quilt that shape. Now, if I just quilt shapes and fill them in and don't use any echoing, it'll just kind of blend into each other. So I'm going to have to echo it at least once. I'll probably do it a couple more times to build out that shape. So that's kind of what I'm thinking. We'll see. And then as it goes, I can add them, spacing them out. So this is kind of what I'm thinking. Spacing them out and then filling in the space between them with that shape that I like. Let me show you what that looks like. Something like this. So I don't know, it might not look exactly like that when I'm done, but that's kind of what I'm thinking. And even though it looks, I don't know, a little over the top, I have to remember that I'm showing it with black markings here, and it's not going to be that stark. And I'm going to use a thread color that's not quite as drastic as black on white. Another thing I thought of is I could just take that shape and use that middle shape, but once I did that, I'm like, I don't know, it doesn't look quite as good. I think this is probably going to be what I'll do. So I'll start with that first row, and then we'll just kind of see where it evolves from there. So like I said, you don't have to have the whole thing planned out. You don't have to know everything you're doing, but if it makes you feel comfortable getting started that way, then you definitely can make it as detailed as you want. As far as thread color goes, I was kind of thinking like, ooh, what kind of thread color am I going to use? I think I'm going to go with like a light aqua in the background, where it's going to show up a little bit, but not so much that it's drastic. I think that the block is pretty bold enough that it should be able to stand on its own. So hopefully that's helped give you a little bit of the crazy things I think of when picking designs. But again, just remember, if you get quilting or if I get quilting and I want to change it, there's nothing wrong with doing that. I think there's some kind of quote that's like, no plan survives the first punch of battle or something like that. Looks like Jessica's writing down a ton of questions, so let's see if you have any of those. Again, I'm not going to be back next week, but I'll be back in 2 weeks and hopefully have this finished. New glasses, cute. Yes, it has happened. You know when you hit 40, so I have some new glasses. It's new for me. I've never worn glasses or contacts, but I will tell you, it is doing the live chat that made me realize I needed it, because I'm looking at my monitor and I'm like, what does it say up there? So thank you. It's definitely interesting to get used to. I have a Tula EPP quilt ready to quilt. I'm struggling on how to applique it to the top. Okay, sorry. I have an EPP quilt top ready to put onto the fabric for like the quilt top. I'm struggling how to applique it to the top. Any suggestions? Oh, this is about as big as I've ever appliqued a piece on there. It is not fun. I haven't done anything bigger than that, and that's not really my wheelhouse. I will say, think of it kind of like when you're making your quilt sandwich. Lay out your background fabric as tight, as flat as you can. Pin it as much as you can, and then just know that when you quilt it, it'll take care of any of those little, ruffles. Even this particular one, it wasn't very big, but there's some spots you can tell it's not laying exactly flat, but I'll quilt it to submission. I wish I had some better tips for you, but I've not done that yet. So if you're watching the live chat, leave it in the comments. I'm sure they'll be glad to have your advice. When is my new book available? So already people were asking in my type chat before I went live, when am I going to talk about it? I have a new compilation book that kind of pulls together everything I've ever written. It's like a huge, great book. Anyway, we're going to talk about it in the next live chat. And pre-order is available now. So if you want to go to the website, you can check that out. You can see a little bit about what that looks like. Super excited about that. It's just crazy sometimes to think that I've written books. How do I choose a nice design that will not over quilt it or will not stiffen the quilt itself? So the great thing about design is the density is what's going to affect the drape of the quilt. So I didn't really talk about that, and that's probably something I should have mentioned. When you're picking out a design, you can just spread out the spacing between the lines, and that will give you a nice, softer kind of cuddle. Another thing that will help with that is using a batting that has a natural fibers like cotton or wool, because it just gives you that nice drape. But really, any design should be able to be adapted to that. So we know I like to quilt things to death, so that's just kind of how I roll. But that's just, hopefully that helps you there. Are there dot-to-dot designs in the majority of your quilts? If you were to take pictures of all the quilting I've ever done, you're probably going to see about 10 different designs. I There's nothing wrong with learning 100 different swirls, but I like to use designs that I already know how to use in different ways. So dot to dot, being a versatile design, is on a lot of my quilts. Not every quilt, but it's on a lot of them, especially since I know it works in littler blocks like this quilt top, and I can adapt it for bigger blocks too. Dot to dot, continuous curves, a swirl meander, those are designs, wishbones. You'll see that in a lot of my quilts because they are so versatile. And those are what I like to quilt. And as you get more comfortable with your designs, you're going to develop your own quilting toolbox, and those are going to be your go-to ones. So that was a very long answer to yes, there are dot to dot designs in a majority of my quilts. I have a quilt with log cabin blocks. How do you quilt these? It depends. So log cabin blocks are fun and stunning, but there's so many variables that would impact how I quilted it. How big are the blocks? What is the color placement? Does it make a secondary pattern in the quilt? So it's hard to answer that just in a quick thing, but I will tell you, my next free motion challenge quilting along video series will be a help how do you quilt it, and it will include log cabin blocks. So it might not be able to help you now, but coming up soon, you'll get some ideas there. How do I quilt a large square with a bold print? With a flower meander, a swirl meander. I might add some echoing around the outside, but a bold fabric, you could just go around the detail in the fabric and call it good. Again, if you're not going to see the quilting anyway, I don't want to do anything too ornate because you're not going to be able to see it. So hopefully that helps. Well, I have more of my t-shirts at Quilt Walk. I ruined my Echo, Echo, Echo shirt. Now, Jessica wrote an unhappy face. I think that means we don't have them anymore. I'm so sorry. We do have shirts, but Echo, 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 we don't anymore. I'm sorry. Will I try out designs on clear preview paper for your crystal quilt? I probably won't. So the idea being I could put that clear see-through and draw out the designs. The more you work with quilting designs, the more you can look at the quilt and imagine them on there. And the best example I have is if you've pieced quilts, you could probably look at this and imagine it in black and white or red and black because you've worked with fabric colors before. And the same is true with quilting designs. Now, if I'm having trouble deciding how to quilt, and that happens to this day, and I'm like, I can't figure out what to do. One thing I will do is I'll take a picture with my cell phone and then I draw on that picture with my pen. But yeah, auditioning designs sometimes helps you kind of get a visualization of how it goes together. But most importantly, it lets me see how am I going to work from one to the next. So hopefully that makes sense. How do you know when to stitch in the ditch or to outline a shape? I'm never really sure. Or to outline a shape emphasis. I'm never really sure. The good thing is you do it whenever you want. So I use stitching in the ditch to help move from block to block. So in this example, if I need to, move around, I might stitch in the ditch around the outside. If you want a rule of thumb, or like a rule to follow, I like stitching in the ditch, and so I outline the shape I'm filling in. So if I'm looking at this block and I decide I'm going to quilt this as one section, I'm going to outline the outside of that section and then fill it in. So instead of outlining every piece and then quilting the design over the top of that. But the thing is, there's no right or wrong. I mean, truly, try not to overthink that. It's a tool, and I think it looks great, but it doesn't really, I think, take away from it if you do or don't. That's just my opinion. No hate mail on that. Any ideas for a rectangular grandmother flower type EPP? I'm struggling with how to quilt it. Okay, I'm going to ask, are the blocks big or small? What does that fabric placement look like? Usually smaller blocks are tricky, especially in that flower because it's, you can't fit anything too crazy in there. If they're bigger, you can maybe add some more detail. But usually if you're talking like little hexies, bold prints, I might just do continuous curve. Or I might pick out a couple of the flowers that are my favorite, maybe quilt a flowery kind of design in that, and then do something different in the rest. Again, it's really hard to give, concrete suggestions because it does depend on a lot of those things. But hopefully the live chat gave you some things to think about, or if nothing else, let you see what I'm thinking about. And I'll be back again, not next week, but in 2 weeks. And then we'll see what this finishing looks like. And I plan on taking some video and pictures of in progress so we can see how it kind of all unfolds. I'm kind of excited about it, so it'll be a good time. Well, I hope you all stay safe and have fun, and I'll see you in 2 weeks for the next live chat.